Today's episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, an incredible and incredibly affordable place to watch thousands of non-fiction movies and shows. More on them in a bit. It sounds like a textbook case of dramatic irony. Further proof that God may not play dice with the universe, but he does point and laugh at us, like Nelson Muntz. From the earliest age, Benjamin Harrison believed he was destined for great things. To be not just somebody, but the somebody all other somebodies envied. When he was elected president in 1888, it must have felt like this was coming true, that it'd become the focal point of the universe. And now for the ironic from God. Because while Harrison may have made it to the top, that's not how history remembers him. Voted out after just one term, Harrison today is a model of obscurity. Historians usually rank him 30th or worse on their list of presidential greatness. In 2012, a magazine even named him, only half-jokingly, the most forgotten president of all time. Yet, does Benjamin Harrison really deserve this dire non-reputation? Today, Biographics is delving into the life of the 23rd president and arguing that there was more to Harrison than meets the eye. When covering 19th century presidents, we often start with a hard-scrabble backstory, the crazy obstacles that they had to overcome. Grover Cleveland's dad was dying, for example, leaving him struggling to support the family, or William McKinley was going to fight in the Civil War while still a teenager. But not Benjamin Harrison. Oh no. Born on the 20th of August, 1833 in Ohio, the future 23rd president arrived in a world that was positively gilded with greatness. His father, John Scott Harrison, was a prosperous farmer who would later serve in the House of Representatives. His great-grandfather, Colonel Benjamin Harrison, had been one of the signatories to the Declaration of Independence. Yet it was his grandpa who represented the family's high point. William Henry Harrison was the 9th president of the United States, elected in 1840 when Benjamin was still a boy. They were close, too. Although he'd grown up doing all of the usual farm boy things, hunting, fishing, probably cow tipping, Benjamin was also fond of trotting over to Grandpa's estate and losing himself for hours in the older man's vast library. When William Henry won the White House, it felt like a natural progression, another step upwards for an emerging American dynasty. But as you probably remember from the Animaniacs President's song, that great step wound up being more like the briefest tiptoe. And that's because William Henry Harrison died after a mere 30 days in office. Even with his grandpa's abrupt death, though, Benjamin seems to have kept his sense of destiny, his sense that his family would return to the top. For all his dad might try to talk him out of politics, the boy became convinced that he would one day do something so great it would overshadow even President Grandpappy. Sadly, this conviction would leave an unpleasant stain on his soul. As he became a fully grown man, well, relatively, he topped out at 5'6", earning himself the nickname Little Ben, Harrison developed a personality you might politely call difficult. If you were being impolite, you'd say he was arrogant and dry, with a manner so cold it was practically Antarctic. His nickname, the Human Iceberg, should give you some idea how his contemporaries saw him, and just listen to the only two vices he ever indulged in: smoking cigars and eating cucumbers. Yes, if presidential history were a high school movie, Benjamin Harrison would definitely be the nerd getting pantsed by jocks like Andrew Jackson. But while Harrison may have found it difficult to make friends on a personal level, his personality deficits tended to vanish before a crowd. While 2 minutes alone together would be enough to make you hate him, if you were in a crowd or jury he was speaking to, you'd go away ready to follow him into hell. Nor was it solely down to his onstage charisma. Harrison worked damn hard all his life, mastering his brief at the expense of sleep and a family life. There's a revealing story from 1857 after he moved to Indiana and became Indianapolis's city attorney. Faced with a poisoning case he needed to prosecute the next day, Harrison zipped over to a doctor's house and borrowed all the books he could find on the effects of poison. He then stayed up all night reading before walking into court the next day and proceeding to wow everyone with his knowledge on the subject. Perhaps it's no surprise his local Republican Party was soon encouraging him to run for state Supreme Court reporter, a post Harrison won in 1860. Yet the joy of winning would be short-lived, because in 1860 a hurricane was poised to sweep through America, a storm of blood and iron that would upend the lives of everyone from the lowliest slave to the brightest star of a political dynasty. We're talking, of course, about the Civil War. On the night of May the 13th, 1864, Colonel Benjamin Harrison sat in his tent composing what he thought might be his last ever letter. Just days earlier, his regiment had joined the Army of the Cumberland under the legendary General William T. Sherman. Now they were taking part in the Atlanta campaign, the fabled assault on the Confederacy's heart that would see Georgia's capital reduced to ashes. That very day, the Battle of Resaca had broken out. Tomorrow, Harrison would have to join the fighting. But not before he finished one last letter to his wife. The pair had married in 1853. Socially confident, outgoing, loved by everyone she met, Caroline Lavinia Scott was everything the future president wasn't. Now, Harrison was trying to find words that might soothe her if he never came home. "I'm thinking much of you and the dear children," he wrote. "I send up to God this night that you should lose a husband and they a father in the fight, that you may find abundant consolation. I know you will not forget me, but let your grief be tempered by the consolation that I died for my country." Just a few hours later, as his words were making their slow way north, Colonel Harrison would lead a semi-suicidal charge on a Confederate artillery battery. It would be a bloody affair, one as ferocious as Harrison had feared, with brutal hand-to-hand combat to secure the guns. But in one important respect, the colonel would be wrong. That letter wouldn't be his last. Benjamin Harrison would live to fight another day. For a guy General Sherman would later commend for his fighting spirit, the story of how the 23rd president got sucked into the Civil War is surprisingly done. While other future presidents like Rutherford B. Hayes and William McKinley signed up after Fort Sumter was bombarded, Harrison was essentially guilted into taking part. In summer of 1862, he visited the governor of Indiana on business, only for the governor to instead go on about how depressed he was feeling because not enough locals were signing up to fight. He kept this up until Harrison volunteered to raise a regiment, at which point the governor was suddenly all like, "Great, I knew I could count on you. Go and get him, Benny boy." Initially, the plan was for Harrison to raise the regiment, train the troops, and then return to civilian life once they went off to fight. But the further things moved, the more guilt Harrison started to feel. Here he was, recruiting men with fine speeches, sending them off into a meat grinder from which many would never return. The least he could do, he finally decided, was to go with them. And that's how Benjamin Harrison found himself with the rank of colonel, leading the 70th Indiana Regiment south to do battle. For those of us tasked with writing about him, this was in many ways the real pinnacle of Harrison's life. As commander, he seemed to have an instinct for dealing with common soldiers, acting the hard ass when he needed to, but also doing things like personally taking coffee to men standing guard on cold nights. Like the best officers, he led from the front, but he also pored over old military books, studying tactics that might give his regiment an edge and a better chance of survival. And clearly it worked. When the Atlanta campaign ended, the Indiana 70th was mostly still intact. Harrison hadn't just survived, but had been promoted to brigadier general. He fully intended to go on, hoping to join Sherman's infamous March to the Sea. Sadly, an attack of scarlet fever laid him low for a month, but by the time he recovered, the Union Army wanted him behind the scenes, training new recruits in South Carolina. He was still there when the war finally ended. For Harrison, the Civil War would always be something he looked back on with horror, as a dirty business where he did his duty and nothing more. Yet he would never forget the men who fought under him, the rank-and-file soldiers who risked so much. And when the time came, the future president was going to fight like hell to reward their bravery. So, look, here you are in the middle of an educational video on YouTube, and I'm going to make a fairly safe bet that you rather like learning things, and if I'm right, I think you're going to love the sponsor of today's episode, CuriosityStream. So look, you're here enjoying a biography on a channel all about biographies. Well, if you'd like to get more in-depth looks at people's lives that go beyond the 20 to 30-minute profiles that we do here, there are some great shows on CuriosityStream that you'll love. American Icons looks at notable people from American history, FDR, Babe Ruth, Lincoln, or hop over the pond, and there's an hour-long documentary all about William the Conqueror, and these are just a couple of examples. There's tons of stuff. Plus, you can watch CuriosityStream pretty much anywhere. Just grab a few minutes on your phone if you're out and about, or put it up on the big screen TV at home, whatever you like. It's also available worldwide, so you can access their full library of content wherever you are. Then speaking of content, you'll never run out, as in addition to thousands of programs already on the service, they're adding new shows every week. So, go to curiositystream.com/biographics for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And for you guys, use the promo code Biographics and you will save 25%, which comes out to only $14.99 a year, which makes it $1.25 a month, which is just kind of ridiculous. And now back to today's video. As an officer beloved by his men and admired by his superiors, it's arguable that his Civil War service was the culmination of Harrison's career, the moment where he finally did those great things that he was destined for. But that's not how the man himself saw it. Mustered out on June 8, 1865, Harrison returned to Indiana. While he initially seemed content to resume his law practice, it wasn't long before a new ambition began burning in his soul. Little Ben wanted to get into politics. It was a bumpy journey. Harrison tried running for the Indiana Republican gubernatorial nomination in 1872, only to not even win the blessing of his own party. When he did win the nomination 4 years later, he then went on to lose the election. For many political wannabes, this could have been the end, but not for Benjamin Harrison, not in the febrile year of 1876. 1876, you see, was the year of the closest run election in U.S. history. That year, Democrat Samuel Tilden won the popular vote against Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, but neither candidate gained enough votes to win the Electoral College. That's because 4 states returned disputed electors. We'll go into the ins and outs when we finally do our Rutherford B. Hayes video, but the upshot is that for a handful of months, no one knew who would be the 19th president. Benjamin Harrison sure acted like he knew the outcome. As one of Hayes' most vociferous supporters, Harrison made a name for himself publicly backing the Republican, a move that came to be seen as genius when Hayes was awarded the presidency by a single electoral vote. The result was a grateful President Hayes doing stuff like appointing Harrison to powerful commissions, which Harrison used to increase his profile in the party. That meant Harrison being allowed to chair Indiana's delegation to the 1880 Republican Convention, where he again showed an uncanny instinct by picking the dark horse winner, James Garfield. And while Garfield's assassination in his short presidency was the ultimate Monday, for Harrison, everything would be lasagna. Now a power player in the GOP, Harrison was soon made senator from Indiana. Now, if you're confused as to why he didn't have to run for election, well, senators have only been directly elected since Woodrow Wilson's era. In the 1880s, they were appointed by the party controlling the state. That meant Harrison was able to sit as senator so long as the GOP controlled Indiana, and that gave him a chance to shape his future political platform. Looking back, it's remarkable how much of his White House tenure is reflected in Little Ben's Senate career. From 1881 to 1887, he fought tirelessly for increased benefits for Civil War veterans, conservation of American wilderness, and the admission of Dakota as a state, this being before anyone decided to split it into North and South. He then continued his uncanny streak for picking winners, or at least not picking the losers. In 1884, Harrison was noticeably lukewarm about his party's nominee, James G. Blaine. Although he didn't follow some colleagues in switching support to the Democrats, he clearly didn't think Blaine was up to the job, nor did the public. Blaine lost to Grover Cleveland that November, the first Republican to lose a presidential election since 1854. And that set up Harrison perfectly for his own shot at the White House. At the 1888 convention, James G. Blaine tried to win his party's nomination for a second time. Fearing a repeat of the party's split 4 years earlier, those in charge desperately cast around for somebody, anybody, who could take Blaine's place. Somebody all factions could live with. They found that somebody in Benjamin Harrison. Running as a rejuvenated Republican, Harrison went toe-to-toe with President Grover Cleveland that November. Well, we say toe-to-toe, but that sounds much too much like a fight. And while there were some blows exchanged in the press, the 1888 campaign was remarkably civil. Harrison ran on supporting a protective tariff to help American manufacturers. Cleveland ran against it. When the results came in, it was clear who had the better offer. Although Cleveland had won the popular vote by 90,000, it lost the key tariff-supporting swing state of New York by a razor-thin margin. This, combined with Harrison just carrying his own swing state of Indiana, handed the Republicans an Electoral College victory. While it might have been an extremely close race, though, Harrison had no intention of governing like a guy with a tiny mandate. Instead, he was going to use the GOP's new trifecta to force through policies that would soon upend America. So, here we are. Benjamin Harrison has finally become the 23rd president, inaugurated 100 years after George Washington first took the job. But if you're now itching to hear what he did, we should make one thing clear. Presidents in Harrison's time didn't really do much of anything. Today, we see presidents out front shaping the country and muscling through an ambitious agenda. Hence all those dark Brandon memes reinventing Biden as a dude out to kick ass and chew bubblegum. This is thanks to guys like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, guys who used the presidency to take America by the nuts and drag it in their preferred direction. But in the post-Civil War era, that just wasn't how things were done. Real power was vested in Congress. While you might get someone like Grover Cleveland vetoing bills he didn't like, most presidents just kind of went with the flow. So when we spend the next 2 chapters of today's video discussing Harrison's ups and downs, it's important to keep in mind that he's leading the way on very few of them. In fact, it'd be more accurate to think of his achievements as, at best, joint projects undertaken with the 51st Congress, and worst as stuff Congress simply sent him to sign. This is the case with the really big bills of Harrison's presidency, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sponsored by Senator John Sherman, the bill was recognition that America was less the land of the free markets and more a nation being force-fed metaphorical manure by price-rigging cartels. Passed in 1890, the act was the first to authorize trust building. A decade and a bit later, Teddy Roosevelt would famously build on it to smash up monopolies. But while this bill was important enough to remain on the books today, it's an example of something Harrison had little influence on, besides him basically going, "Cool idea, bro." Yet, that's not to say Benjamin Harrison never pushed forward a project close to his heart. On the issue of conservation, the president was light years ahead of his era. Back in 1881, while serving as senator, Harrison had visited Yellowstone, then newly minted as a national park. Always an admirer of the great outdoors, Harrison had, like most Americans, been enchanted by drawings of this wild and rugged land. Now, seeing it in person, he seems to have fallen all over again for the continent's wilderness. Back in the Senate and then in the White House, Harrison pressed hard for more land to be set aside at a federal level, for commercial activity to be banned in more areas of beauty. In 1890, he oversaw the creation of 3 new national parks: Yosemite, Sequoia, and now defunct General Grant Park that would later be replaced by Kings Canyon. He also tried to create a 4th around the Grand Canyon, only for a skeptical Congress to block him, presumably on the grounds that it was just some big hole in the ground. But while creating some of the USA's earliest national parks was a big step, Harrison's real achievement came with forests. Worried that commercial companies were tearing down all the nation's trees, Little Ben pushed Congress to sign the 1891 Forest Reserve Act. Under its broad powers, Harrison was able to protect 22 million acres of woodlands, an area larger than Scotland. Now, this is yet another law that Teddy Roosevelt would soon use to a much greater effect, protecting 10 times the amount of land that Harrison did. But the important point is that Benjamin Harrison was the pioneer. Without his love of nature, there would have been no law for Teddy to wield in the first place. Nor was it just landscapes the 23rd president had a soft spot for. During his term, Harrison would challenge Canada and Great Britain over fur seal hunting in the Bering Sea. This was done partially with economic interests in mind. Too many dead seals would wipe out some Alaskan communities. But it was also out of a concern for an endangered species. In short, conservation was perhaps the biggest area where we can look at Benjamin Harrison's presidency and say, yeah, he actually took the lead on that. But it wouldn't be the only area. See, the new president also had some extremely progressive views on perhaps the most explosive issue of the day, improving America's fast deteriorating race relations. If they gave points for good intentions, Benjamin Harrison would sit somewhere near the top of presidential rankings thanks entirely to his civil rights work. For an era when American race relations were not just approaching rock bottom but already tunneling through the mantle, Harrison was progressive as hell. That meant appointing ex-slave and leading intellectual Frederick Douglass as minister to Haiti. It also meant supporting the federal elections bill designed to re-enfranchise black folk living under early Jim Crow. It also meant backing the Blair Education Bill, intended to boost literacy rates among the poorest African Americans to get around the Deep South's literacy tests. In Harrison's era, these were not small steps, and he backed them up, making speeches where he accused those saying, let the states handle it, of turning a blind eye to racial violence. So, given all of that, why don't we now remember Little Ben as a great civil rights president? The sad answer is because nothing actually got done. While the president pushed these bills, Congress cared way more about arcane stuff like free silver. In fact, they cared so much that some Western Republicans cut backroom deals. In return for joining them on free silver, they'd let the Democrats filibuster Harrison's civil rights stuff. And that's how the rights, prosperity, and even the lives of swaths of black Southerners came to be sacrificed on the cross of silver. All of which handily brings us to one of the administration's biggest screw-ups, the Sherman-Silver Act. Now, we're not going to go into it much here, firstly because we already touched on it in our Grover Cleveland video, and secondly because, well, it's pretty boring. But just know that one of the major debates of the 1890s was whether dollars should be backed not just by gold, but also by silver. The Sherman-Silver Act made this law, mandating the Treasury buy hectons of shiny metal and allowing people to exchange their paper money for either silver or gold. It was supposed to make everyone richer. Instead, it caused a crash of the price of silver, and the nation's gold reserves were almost wiped out when people began exchanging their silver-bought dollars for gold. This was such a monumental mess that it's been partially blamed for the Panic of 1893, the worst depression on record that's not got the word great attached to it. Nor was it the administration's only fiscal disaster. The 51st Congress had a lot of active members, one of whom was future President William McKinley, who authored something called the McKinley Tariff. Coming into force in 1890, it yanked up import taxes on 1,500 goods, the idea being it would protect American manufacturing. In reality, it sent consumer prices through the floor. But then, that was just how the 51st Congress rolled. Having come in with a huge budget surplus, the Republicans had proceeded to spunk it all up the wall, becoming the first Congress in history to appropriate $1 billion. Some of this went on extremely worthwhile stuff like expanding benefits to Civil War veterans, a pet project of Benjamin Harrison, but far too much of it was perceived to be wasteful spending, and voters were outraged. And that doomed Harrison's chances of re-election. The 1890 midterms did to the GOP what a well-timed anvil dropped from a great height does to a wily coyote. The party was smashed, walloped, pounded into the dirt while the Democrats looked on, going, well, meep, meep. They lost 93 House seats, still one of the top 3 shellackings suffered by a ruling party in a midterm. Party stalwarts like William McKinley were swept out on a wave of the brightest. And the new 52nd Congress had no intention of playing ball with the president, hence why the second half of Harrison's term is so empty, so devoid of major achievements, peppered mostly by losses like Congress refusing to approve his plan to annex Hawaii or refusing to authorize money to build a canal across Central America. Had he managed to win a second term, it's possible Harrison could have turned this around, could have found other projects to push forward, but alas, it wasn't to be. After just 4 short years, the American public was going to consign the 23rd president to the dustbin of history. In the end, the 1892 election was almost a perfect rerun of 1888 with some crucial differences. Having been nominated as the only man capable of holding his party together, Harrison had now become the despised frontrunner that everyone wanted to ditch. The problem was, there was no clear alternative. James G. Blaine was still around, but that would just repeat the problems of 1884. William McKinley wanted to run, but he was still too young. So in the end, the GOP stuck with Harrison. And when the Democrats re-nominated Grover Cleveland, it became a rematch. Only this time, it would be tainted by tragedy. You may have heard the phrase October surprise, something that comes out in the last month of a presidential race, like, I don't know, the FBI investigating someone's email, and it shakes up the entire contest. Well, 1892 had its own October surprise, but rather than energize either side, it instead sucked all of the wind out of everyone's sails. On October the 25th, Harrison's wife died. With just 2 weeks left, the president was plunged into mourning. He barely made any speeches. He appeared in public only twice. When he got the news, Grover Cleveland likewise stopped campaigning out of respect. The result was an unnatural quiet as the country approached polling day, and a president who hardly cared whether he won or whether he lost. And that may have been for the best. When the results were announced, Cleveland had, like the last time, narrowly won the popular vote. Unlike last time, though, he also swept the swing states to gain electoral college victory. Harrison's response to this defeat: he told friends it was like being freed from prison. The 23rd president left the White House in March 1893 for a short and obscure retirement. In many ways, he was lucky to get out when he did. The Panic of 1893 would collapse the nation's economy within months, leaving Cleveland battered by events and so damaging the Democrats that they wouldn't return to the White House until 1913. By then, though, Benjamin Harrison would be long dead. The 23rd president died on March the 13th, 1901, aged 67. He left behind a widow, his second wife, Mary Dimmock, a woman 25 years his junior. He left behind 2 millions of acres of preserved forest, plus the 6 states admitted under his administration, still the most admitted by a single president. Sadly, he also left behind a stench of failure. Today, Benjamin Harrison is broadly forgotten, his reputation not terrible enough to make him one of history's hate figures, but also not great enough to make him an unsung hero. In fact, you could probably argue his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, remains the better-known president simply by holding the record of shortest term served. For all he dreamed of achieving greatness, it seems that the younger Harrison never even came close. Or did he? As this video has hopefully shown, there was much more to Benjamin Harrison than a simple 4-year blank between Grover Cleveland's 2 terms. This was a man, after all, who was a Civil War hero, a guy who led men into hell and cannon fire and lived to tell the tale. In the White House, too, he was far-sighted, someone who tried his best on both conservation and civil rights, even if the reality often fell short of his ideals. To be clear, we're not arguing that Harrison was secretly a great president. There were just too many misses for that, too many transformative bills that died in the Senate. But we are arguing that perhaps he's been overlooked, that perhaps he was more forward-thinking and interesting than he's ever given credit for. He may not have achieved truly great things, but to paraphrase Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, God damn it, at least he did that.